Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
This happened when I was in college. I attended a small liberal arts school in Missouri. The setting was pretty, but rural. The nearest legitimate city was a 30-minute drive. It was the type of place prospective students would tour and immediately know if the location was a deal breaker. The campus was built into a modestly sized forest valley. The access to hiking, fishing, and any other outdoor hobby you might have was way more than you could ask for, if you were willing to look at it that way. Every small school tries to distinguish itself in some way from its peers. My college obviously hung its hat on the dramatic, natural setting. In terms of the student experience, they touted great access to the facilities. The fitness center was open 24 hours, the dining hall was almost always offering something, and you could be in the library all night. I was lucky to have a scholarship covering tuition, but books and fees were thousands more, so I had to get a job. It was a stroke of luck to find a pretty cake gig sitting at the library circulation desk. I didn't need to do much of anything. Occasionally I'd explain how to interpret our catalog system or point someone to the restroom. At least 90% of my shift I was able to do homework or read, with rare interruptions. The downside was that I was going to be the low person in the pecking order for a while when it came to shifts. Almost half of my shifts were going to be late at night for the foreseeable future. Every time I entered the library for a graveyard shift, I'd chuckle, remembering the grim origin of the term. I may be tired, I thought, but at least I'm not responsible for digging up a grave in the event of a premature burial. I set up shop in my usual place behind the circulation desk. The library was silent. I could see 3 or 4 people from my chair. Students hunkered in deep, cozy chairs or cubicle-style desks. They all wore headphones, I noticed jealously. Library policy dictated that I could not. I buried my head in biology for the next 90 minutes, preparing my study guide for the coming midterm. My trance was interrupted by a sharp slap sound. I perked up and glanced around the study area. All the desks and chairs had emptied. What was that sound? On the table nearest to me lay a single book. Its dark cover popped against the institutional beige desk. Had that book just slapped down on the desk? How? There was no one there to drop it. It was after 1 a.m. now. The library was nearly always abandoned at this point. I decided to stretch my legs and do a lap of the library. I was supposed to do this once every hour, but it was common knowledge among the student employees in the library that you really never needed to. The set of tables and chairs comprising the study space I could see from my desk was one of 2 in the library. The other was beyond the sprawling rows of stacks that seemed to rarely be inhabited by anyone. I walked to the cluster of tables where the book had been left. This wasn't actually typical. We had return carts all over the library, and people were typically pretty good about dropping books on them as they left. It was Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley. Classic Philip Seymour Hoffman, I thought, remembering the film adaptation. I tucked the book under my arm and began a solitary circuit around the stacks. I'd stopped glancing down each corridor between the stacks ages ago. The instinct to check for someone else had faded over months of empty aisles and unbroken silence during these shifts. Fewer and fewer people wandered into these aisles of the library. The stacks were relics, left to gather dust in the age of the internet. But something shifted in the corner of my vision, slipping out of sight down one of the shadowed aisles. I barely registered it, my body reacting too slowly, my mind not fully processing. By the time the impulse to look kicked in, it was gone, leaving only an unsettled sensation prickling in the back of my neck. A person might be in the library at this hour, sure, but why would they be in the stacks? I don't think I'd ever seen someone actually looking through these old volumes in all my time working here. It was hard to be sure. The lights in the stacks were motion activated to save electricity, and it felt like they would always come on a few paces behind me as I made my way across the building. I rounded the last set of shelves, entering the second study area. It was empty. Well, not quite. Each table was occupied by a single book, one carefully centered on every surface. The sight jolted me. It looked too deliberate. Each volume perfectly positioned in the dead center of its table, as if someone had painstakingly arranged them. The room was silent, but I could almost feel the intent hanging in the air, as if these books had been waiting for someone. Approaching the first table, I registered the title right away, Wuthering Heights. The next was Lolita by Nabokov. Then Stephen King's Misery. This last locked a pattern into place. All pretty dark books, I mused. On second thought, they had more in common than that. These were all stories about unhealthy obsession. Why would someone leave all these out? I pondered with a growing sense of unease. I suddenly felt like a person in a movie who should know they're being watched. I whirled around and saw no one, only the towering stacks forming a wall between me and the front half of the library. A wave of annoyance pushed aside other emotions momentarily. "Cool prank, dumbass," I muttered to the deserted alcove. I gathered the books and was about to head for the circulation desk when it occurred to me to look at the checkout cards on the inside covers. The dates and names in the first 5 books were unremarkable. When I opened the cover of the last book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I let out a shriek as something fluttered out. Stepping back, I saw that it was a large black feather, flipping and drifting to the floor at my feet. I held the book open and saw that this checkout card had been vandalized. It was all colored in with permanent marker. I pulled it out to examine it. On the reverse side, the words, "Keep an eye out, I will," were scrawled in wild, jagged characters. "What the hell?" I murmured to myself. I pocketed the card to save and show to my manager tomorrow. Stooping to pick up the feather, I peeked under the table to make sure no one was waiting to ambush me. Nothing. I stood up and exhaled loudly. I'd been holding my breath. There was no reason to believe that any of this was connected to me, I thought, trying to shake off the unsettling details of this little scene. But then, all at once, I realized I may have been wrong about that. Looking down at the black feather in my hand, I caught a glimpse of my t-shirt. It was a graphic tee from a local bookshop back home in Kansas. Raven Books. On it was a large, black-feathered bird perched on a stack of books. The feather in the book and my t-shirt made this all feel alarmingly close, as if a private detail of my life had been seized upon by a stalker or a creep of some other color. I tucked the feather into the back pocket of my jeans, trying to rationalize it away as a big coincidence and the isolation of the job at this ungodly hour. I told myself that the objective facts here were that there were books on a table in a library, not exactly material for a true crime podcast. With one last glance around the silent space, I headed back toward the front desk, wanting nothing more than to finish my shift and leave. Just as I stepped into the main corridor between the shelves, something caught my eye. Through the narrow gap between two rows of books, I saw movement. I froze and stared intently at the spot. Peering through the books, I suddenly realized I was looking at a face. At first, it was just a fragment. One dark, shining eye gazing straight at me through the space between the books, unblinking and intent. I froze, hoping that somehow I had misinterpreted what I was seeing, that it was a trick of the dim light. But no, there was a face, partially obscured by shadows, half concealed by the row of books. Whoever it was, they didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even move. They just stared. An uncanny sense of recognition stirred in me, as if I'd seen this person before, maybe many times. My mind scrambled to latch onto details. The eye was ringed in darkness, bloodshot, and unnaturally wide. My fingernails dug into my palms, and I had to fight the urge to run, afraid of turning my back. "Hello?" I managed, my voice barely rising above a whisper. No response. The eye remained unblinking, unyielding. I took a shaky step backward, my shoes scuffing against the floor, loud in the library's deathly quiet. Without breaking eye contact, I began to walk backward, intending to circle around the shelves and maybe figure out who this was and dispatch with all the drama. But as soon as I shifted from one foot to the other, the eye vanished, swallowed up in shadow. There was a heartbeat of silence, then a faint, scratching sound drifted through the stacks, like a fingernail trailing along the edge of a book spine. It grew louder, moving toward the far end of the row. Whoever it was, they were moving, their path tracing from the far left. Then, right in front of me. Then, moving away again. I stood, paralyzed with indecision. Dealing with a person so odd had never been part of my job. I sat at a circulation desk in a library, not at an intake desk in a psych ward. I had to know who was watching me, who had orchestrated this entire unsettling scene. With a deep breath, I paced to the end of the aisle where the face had vanished, all my fear churning into a strange, reckless anger. I rounded the corner and saw him. A man stood in the narrow corridor, cloaked in near darkness. I don't know why neither of us were triggering the motion sensor lights. His face was half hidden by a hood, but I could make out enough to see that he was much older than a typical student. His skin was sallow, a carpet of stony gray stubble on his cheeks. He looked like he'd walked out of the stacks themselves, a fixture of dust and shadow. In his hand, he gripped something dark and jaunty. Was it a bird's wing? It glinted in the dim light. He raised it slowly, eyes fixed on me in a feverish stare. It was a bird's wing. There were slight and yellowing bones protruding from the end. "Why are you watching me?" My voice wavered, but I held his gaze, willing my feet not to move. He didn't answer. Then he took one confident step forward, and another, each step a slow, ominous threat. I instinctively backed up, retreating in reverse, down the corridor, until I bumped into a book return cart at the end. I wasn't trapped. I could move the cart, but he was almost on top of me now. The man stopped only inches away from me, his breath shallow and rattling. "Keep an eye out," he whispered, his tone striking something between passion and paranoia. "You're special, you know. All the books. They showed me." I stared, rigid with shock, as he raised the raven's wing to his face and breathed in deeply, his eyes rolling back cartoonishly in their sockets. I pressed back against the cart, my heart pounding, wondering if anyone could hear me if I screamed. Just then, the silence broke, with heavy footsteps echoing down the main aisle. I screamed for help. The man's face contorted like the sound had hurt him physically, his head snapping back violently. He shoved the bird wing into his jacket and bolted past me, pushing the cart over sideways. It fell with a resounding crash that echoed down the hallway. That same moment he rushed by, 2 security guards appeared at the far end of the aisle. At first, I couldn't speak. I just pointed after him. Finally, I sputtered out, "He went that way." The officers took off in pursuit, one of them radioing for the local police to be called as they sprinted down the rows. I heard a scuffle, and the sound of voices, sharp and commanding, followed by the snap of handcuffs. The tension drained from my body as I collapsed against the shelf. One of the officers returned moments later, his face grave. "You okay?" he asked, casting a wary look down the corridor where his partner was securing the man. I nodded, but my hands shook as I handed him the feather and the checkout card. He left these, and those books in the study room. They're so creepy. "I guess I'm not sure if he was going to hurt me," I said, struggling to explain. He had been watching me. The officer's face darkened as he examined the card. "We've had complaints about someone matching his description hanging around campus before," he said, without looking up from the curious items. "But no incidents this focused. Either way, he's under arrest," he concluded, suddenly businesslike. "He had a hunting knife in his jacket, also a digital camera that I can imagine will have candid photos of you on it." As they led the man out of the library, he cast one last depraved look over his shoulder at me, his gaze wild and desperate, like he'd left a piece of himself behind. "Keep an eye out," he rasped before they hustled him through the door. The officers assured me they'd be increasing security checks around campus, especially at the library. I tried to finish my shift, but as I stared at the stacks, all I could think about were his words, echoing in the silence left behind. "You're special," the books showed me. I'm the property manager at a historic mansion in New England. I'm not going to name it specifically, but it was once owned by a famous novelist and now functions as a museum. The grounds are sprawling and beautiful. People come during the day just to walk around the gardens and paths through the woods surrounding the house. The property has plenty of ghost stories about it. The last family members to occupy it as a residence had donated the property, and it was designated as a historical landmark more than 50 years ago. I don't give the tours, but I'm always around the house working on this or that while the tours are moving through. Ghost story questions are among the most common fielded by our guides. I'd never seen anything paranormal in the house, and I don't know anyone who spent more time alone in there than me. The grounds, on the other hand, I think they're absolutely haunted. A short distance from the house is a small covert in the woods. All the family pets are buried there in a little cemetery. Every animal they ever had has a tiny headstone, even a goldfish. During the day, it's cute and a bit sad. But on the occasions I've been here after hours, I've seen things out there in the dark. Once, I was pulling trash bags across the lawn to my golf cart. I would swear I saw a woman wearing a long dress and a quirky-looking hat sitting on a bench in the pet cemetery. I stopped and stared for a moment. She turned and looked at me before standing and moving into the trees. There was something ethereal about her. Her edges weren't sharp. That was years ago. More recently, I hadn't seen much worth talking about. I love my job. I work in a gorgeous place, and I get to work with my hands. I also take pride in keeping an American landmark maintained and clean. It doesn't hurt that I'm almost always on my way home well before 5 p.m. I have my closing time system down to a science, locking doors and emptying trash bins in a logical order so that I can be on the road not long after the last guests have left the parking lot. Summer weekends are an exception to that routine. The house has become a popular wedding venue among the very wealthy. Well, the very wealthy with a particular aesthetic. The house was built around 1900. So if you've got a lot of money and like the neo-Italian classic style, you can have your wedding reception here. I don't work the weddings per se, but I have to be here on site for the duration of the event so that caterers and wedding planners can ask me questions. My least favorite aspect is that I have to wait until everyone is gone before I can lock the gate and go home. And I don't mean just the wedding guests. I have to oversee the departure of the caterers, the DJ, everyone. It can keep me out there until 2 or 3 in the morning. It's the parties with the most young people that seem to keep me up the latest. I guess that shouldn't come as a surprise. They drink the most, dance the longest, and create the most damage to the property. It was 1 a.m. when the last guests were ambling, arm in arm, toward the shuttle buses that would take them to a nearby hotel. I sat on the deck of the large lawnmower I used for the bigger sections of the property, watching them go. It had been a very long night. I'd had to escort 2 separate groups out of the mansion when I'd found them inside. The house itself was off limits to the wedding guests. The bride and groom could pay extra to take their photos in some of the rooms, but that was it. Both parties I'd found inside had the same mission. We want to see a ghost, man. Although the spokesperson of the first group I'd found had been so drunk it sounded more like he wanted to see a ghost. Everyone wanted to see the ghost of the lady of the house, the novelist who'd made this place famous. You're only going to find an exhausted caretaker here tonight, guys, I thought. As the last shuttle's taillights disappeared down the winding driveway, I allowed myself a sigh of relief, stretching my legs before climbing off the mower. Only the caterers remained, gathering their things in the kitchen. In another 20 minutes I'd be alone, with nothing but silence and crickets and the occasional breeze to keep me company as I made my final rounds through the grounds. As I started emptying the bins outside the kitchen, I saw something move at the edge of the woods, near the pet cemetery. I blinked, squinting against the dim glow of the security light. A shadow, no, a figure stood there, facing the house. He was tall, really tall, wearing something dark and bulky, like an old coat. His face was darkened. My pulse quickened. I thought it might have been one of the caterers having a cigarette. But a quick look back at the service entrance revealed they were all accounted for, packing their vans. I felt a shock of irritation. Another ghost-hunting straggler who couldn't take a hint? I set down the bag and approached him, calling out in the most authoritative voice I could muster, "We're closed for the night. It's time to head out." The figure didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, not even turning his head toward my voice. The irritation I'd felt moments ago morphed into something colder as I drew closer. He was still far away enough that I couldn't make out any details of his face, but there was something off about the way he stood, something oddly rigid. He looked like he'd been frozen in an unnatural pose, like those poor Romans petrified at Vesuvius. "Hello?" I called, my voice softer now, but again, no response. I was close enough to see the outline of his shoulders, squared and unmoving, when a metallic clatter echoed from the catering vans behind me. I flinched, glancing back at the house, and when I turned back, the figure was gone. The space he'd occupied impossibly vacated in the instant I'd looked away. I stood there, 30 feet or so from the mouth of the pet cemetery, scanning the tree line, every instinct urging me to leave, to get to the other side of the mansion and finish up so I could go home. But there was a tug of curiosity. If this was a trespasser, it was my job to ensure he wasn't lurking around after hours. Glancing back at the house, I saw the catering van's headlights nosing around the driveway and out the gate. I stepped to the edge of the woods where I'd seen him standing, peering between the trees. The pet cemetery lay just a few yards beyond, bathed in moonlight. I walked slowly toward it, my footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, and then there he was again, on the other side of the cemetery, just barely visible through the trees. Again, his posture was uncomfortably severe. "All right," I muttered, my patience wearing thin as I began cautiously in his direction, determined to get a good look this time. But as I crossed among the scattering of miniature headstones, he backed away and was gone amidst the trees. Backed away isn't the right phrase because it was so fluid. I can't imagine how he was taking steps. It was like he slid away from me as I closed in. "Hello?" I tried again, louder. But only the quiet of the woods responded. I scanned the cemetery. The little stone markers winked up at me from the long grass, surprisingly stark in the moonlight. I picked my way between them, making a beeline for the house. But just as I crossed the cemetery boundary, I felt something behind me. A cold, heavy hand pressing firmly against my back. Before I could react, I was shoved violently forward, stumbling into the dirt. My palms scraped against rocks and roots as I barely caught myself from face planting into the ground. I whipped around, heart pounding, fully expecting to see the tall man right behind me. But the clearing was empty. There was no one. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around, my eyes scanning the shadows, desperate to catch a sight of whoever or whatever had pushed me. The figure was gone. The trees swayed sleepily in the breeze, and my own breath sounded deafening in the silence. With my heart hammering, I backed out of the cemetery, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd last seen the figure. When I reached the mansion, I half-jogged to my car, locking the doors and gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The next morning, I returned to the pet cemetery, feeling foolish, but needed to check if anything was out of place. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of vandalism, just the diminutive, light gray headstones, shiny with dew. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on something I hadn't noticed before. There, lying in front of one of the stones, was a small bouquet of wildflowers. The cuts on the stems looked fresh and damp, as if placed there only hours before. I tried to remember if wildflowers had been used at the wedding, but couldn't picture them. A shiver ran through me as I walked away, casting one last glance back at the clearing. Had there been a trespasser? Or had I brushed up against something else entirely? Something that didn't want me there? I'll never know for sure. I still love my job, but now I pay a local kid to do the mowing out by the pet cemetery.